Hello, Lisa. How are you? Happy Tuesday. Joke of the day. So, what do you get when you cross a fishing lure and a gym sock? You get a hook, line, and stinker. Yes. Well, hope you're having a good day. What I have for you today is we're going to begin our talk through the 1850s and the politics of slavery, kind of go like halfway through the decade. So, there's a good bit of notes at the end of this video. But at the end of that, our buddy John Brown kind of emerges onto the scene. So, hopefully, you're gotten yourself somewhat familiar with John Brown since he is the subject of your paper, which is due next Wednesday, right? So, reminder that you have that. There's also another short video on here that talks a little bit about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, goes into more details on that. You have that. For homework, I have a petition about the New Jersey's version of the fugitive slave law. And you'll see New Jersey has a kind of not so great history in terms of this, in which New Jersey kind of acts more like a southern state than a northern state. As you'll see that from the very short kind of homework assignment that I have for you there. Yeah, but other than that, I hope all is well. Stay safe, stay smart, and talk to you guys later. We'll begin our conversation through the 1950s, which is basically all about politics and slavery. And this question of politics and slavery kind of intersecting begins with California, right? So California is ready to become a state. Remember, you have only the gold rush year before, but they have enough people to become a state. So the question then is California a free state or a slave state? The 3630 line, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, cannot work with California because that line goes right through the state of California. So we need a compromise. So we dust off our good friend Henry Clay, and Henry Clay emerges and creates the Compromise of 1850, which angers both the North and the South. So that's how you know it's a good compromise, because nobody's happy. So in this compromise, California would become a free state. The slave trade is abolished in Washington, D.C., but not slavery. So you can still have slaves at the White House. You just cannot buy or sell slaves in Washington, D.C. Utah and New Mexico, which is the rest of the Mexican cession, will have no restrictions on slavery. That question will be decided through something that is called popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty is the idea of Stephen Douglas, who was a senator from Illinois. And popular sovereignty basically says the people that are living there will determine for themselves whether or not they are slaves or free. They'll simply vote. And then lastly, there is a new tough fugitive slave law. And so the fugitive slave law, well, the problem with this was that slaves would escape to the north. And when they escaped to the north, northern governments made it very difficult for Southerners to retrieve their property, even though the Constitution says that, slaves need to be returned back to their Southern masters. State governments made it really difficult for this to happen because states made it illegal to use state resources. So you couldn't use state police officers, you couldn't use state jails, state courts to do this. So if you're a Southern slave owner coming into the North trying to get your slaves, you're getting no assistance whatsoever from Northern governments. The fugitive slave law changes this. And the fugitive slave law basically turned the North into a hunting ground for slaves. Blacks who are captured in the North are denied a jury trial. They're not allowed to testify against either for themselves in court, which means it is basically the word of the slave catcher versus the word of the slave catcher. And Northerners could be held accountable for assisting fugitive slaves. So the Underground Railroad now becomes even more dangerous for people that way. This law, though, is going to backfire on the South, because what it does is it brings slavery to the North. So now people who didn't really think about slavery before now for the first time see it. And so they get upset about this. So before you could ignore it, it's just a Southern thing, but now you're seeing it as slaves are being captured and dragged through the streets of New York City. You're seeing it now. You combine this with the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which you guys are familiar with through your Do Now exercise. And Uncle Tom's Cabin now kind of fleshes out a story now for some of these fugitive slaves. And now people find themselves emotionally connected to this abolitionist movement as well. So the North now is starting to get a little bit more awake to the horrors and evils of slavery. Moving along now to the Kansas and Nebraska Act, which is the creation of Stephen Douglas, the same guy who gave us popular sovereignty. Um, so his solution now, both Kansas and Nebraska are above the 3630 line. The problem is there's no land below the 3630 line that is ready to become a state. So Stephen Douglas says, well, we'll take the Kansas Nebraska territory, cut it in half, and have the question handled through popular sovereignty, meaning that the people living there will actually vote on whether or not they should be slave or free. This, of course, infuriates Northerners who believe that both Kansas and Nebraska should already be free since they are above the 3630 line. But now you're opening up the possibility for slavery in this territory. So this kind of goes against the Compromise of 1820. And so what we get as a result of this is that you have people begin moving to Kansas with the sole mission of to vote to make Kansas either a free state, meaning free soil, or a slave state. So Northerners, they have a little bit further to go. They move to Kansas. They bring their families. They settle. They plan to make Kansas their homes. Southerners, right next door in Missouri, a slave state, simply cross over into Kansas, establish residency just so they can vote. They have no intentions of living there. They just want to make Kansas a slave state. Um, and so these border ruffians, as they're known, use fear, intimidation, and harassment here to basically rig the vote and scare free soilers or scare pro-Northerners into not wanting to vote and being afraid to vote. So when the first vote is cast, creating a government in Kansas, the Free Soilers lose. And so a pro slavery government is established in Kansas. And their job then is to pass laws, which one would think then would be pro slavery laws. There's a gentleman by the name of John Brown. And John Brown is in Ohio, hears about this, what's going on there from his sons, and is incensed when he hears that nobody is doing anything to stand up and defend themselves. These free soilers are just basically letting themselves get walked all over. And he hears the story of a town called Lawrence, which is attacked by these border ruffians. They come in, they shoot up the place, they burn property, destroy printing presses, and nobody fires a shot to defend the community. John Brown decides he's going to go to Kansas and he's going to do something about it. And so John Brown comes to Kansas, he fills a wagon with rifles, and basically starts a civil war in Kansas. He, his sons, and a small group of other men go to the small town of Potawatomi, or settlement of Potawatomi. They find five families, five different cabins. They break into those cabins and they pull out the men and drag them out in the middle of the night and hack them to pieces with axes and broadswords. This act of violence creates more acts of violence as now ruffians decide that they need to get revenge. And what happens now is Kansas erupts into a civil war. All this is happening in an election year. So everyone kind of thought Stephen Douglas was going to be the guy to run for president, but Stephen Douglas can't run because he's the guy associated with popular sovereignty, which is causing all the violence in Kansas. So the Democrats nominate James Buchanan, who was the ambassador to England. He was outside the country, so you couldn't connect him to any of this. He didn't vote for the Kansas-Nebraska Act. You couldn't blame him for this. And so Buchanan comes in, but we have a brand new opposition party called the Republicans. And the Republicans are an abolitionist party. And so you have the Democratic Party and you have several opposition parties. You still have the Whigs, which are kind of floating around. You have the Republican Party, and you have several other smaller parties. So basically, all the Democrats unite behind James Buchanan. If you don't like James Buchanan, you have several other choices of who you can vote for. Of course, those several other choices divide the vote, and Buchanan is elected and becomes president in 1856. And the first thing Buchanan has to do is figure out what the heck is going on in Kansas. So Kansas, meanwhile, is ready to vote on a state constitution. This will be the final binding vote on whether or not slavery is going to happen in Kansas. And so you have a pro-slavery government creates two constitutional choices. One version says clear-cut slavery is okay. The second version doesn't mention slavery, but does guarantee property rights. And of course, slaves are considered property. So if you vote for one version, you're permitting slavery. If you vote for the other version, you're also permitting slavery, which means if you're a free soiler, if you're someone who's against slavery, you do not have an option that you can vote for. So the free soilers boycott the election. And with only 10% of the people eligible to vote voting, Kansas votes to become a slave state. This, of course, infuriates Northerners, and it also infuriates Stephen Douglas because this is not what he intended by popular sovereignty. And so what happens now, Stephen Douglas is a leading figure of the Democratic Party. Once he's upset with Buchanan, it splits the Democratic Party. So before, the Democratic Party was able to win the election in 1856 because they were the only united party, but now they are divided as well. And the Democratic Party now falls into pieces.